Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you, NDF and IAB for inviting us here today, and thank you for providing a great segue into the next topic, Mary. You may be asking yourself, what do multinational corporations have to do with adaptation? And I just want to list off a few stats because that's what scientists do. The first is multinational corporations are now the #1 consumer of natural resources in the world. They're the #2 largest employer, and they're the 4th largest landowner. So they play a pretty serious role in the adaptation gap. Now, because we're out of the UN zone, I can tell you a little bit about our products. What we are essentially is a climate data house. What we do is provide climate impact assessments for corporations. We assess level of climate risk in their operations and their supply chain, and we do that in a few ways. We map vulnerability. We also do corporate climate risk dashboards, and our latest tool, we screen equities. And I'm proud to announce that we just hit our million mark. What I mean is we have incorporated 1 million assets across the globe into our database. We're looking at tens of thousands of companies, and we're covering about 90% of the countries. So we're hoping that we're able to cover the full universe of indexes that will be valuable for investors. I can skip over our clients and just briefly talk about what we all know already, the economic impacts of climate change on corporations. There's 2 big buckets here, obviously physical risk and transition risk. I'm going to focus largely on the first, which is made up of acute shocks, things like extreme weather events, cyclones, extreme rainfall, even variability, acute droughts, things that can cause serious disruptions within a corporation, or can lead to really high operational costs due to downtime. The second are the stressors, and this is something that we emphasize, and that's the increase in average temperature or variability in precipitation that can really change how a business functions today and 20 years from now. How much cost they're incorporating into their energy output, their water delivery systems, as well as some of their human capital. So I don't have time to go through all this chart or to talk about all the barriers, but we can't talk about corporate adaptation without talking about barriers. And so I selected a couple here that I think are particularly important. The first is the purview of corporations when they're considering climate risk. I'll talk about how that's a little bit limited. The knowledge gap, and then lastly, essentially what I consider incentive structure or a lack of in corporations currently. There's a big emphasis on ROI for assessing adaptation projects still at the corporate level, and that's something that needs to change. So in regards to assessing corporate climate risk, many businesses are generally focused in on their 4 walls. They're trying to determine what exactly can occur at the facility level and understanding climate change as it is, transboundary, external. They're not always considering what sort of risk might affect them outside of those 4 walls. So we show this chart often in the boardroom and tends to spur a pretty interesting conversation about supply chains. Next is the climate knowledge gap. This is something we're all pretty aware of, and if you look at that chart on the right provided by the World Bank, not to take a jab at the World Bank, but as a climate impact modeler, I look at that chart and I can't find a climate signal. I can't tell you exactly what that means. Generally, if you're going to go out as a corporation and try to use climate data to assess your level of climate risk, it's really difficult because there isn't that contextual nature to climate change data that allows corporations to really get a better understanding of the type of climate change impacts they may face as a business. And lastly, this doesn't equal knowledge, right? A lot of these global climate models are too spatially coarse. The time periods are generally too long. Generally, the investment period for corporations is anywhere between about 5 and 15 years. So we try to scale a lot of this down into relevant time periods to make this all more relevant. The next is something I like to call blind spots. Getting back to the idea of climate risk being not just an acute effect that we read in the news when the big storm takes off. The average changes that we're going to see in temperature and rainfall variability are going to have pretty serious effects. The thing is, they're not very easily detectable on a day-to-day basis or month-to-month basis. If you look back 10 or 15 years and you look at average temperature change, that can cost a large business millions of dollars just based on energy consumption. So these small intangibles are really important to look at. Supply chain mapping is an obvious barrier. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of companies that have done good supply chain mapping and know all of the assets that exist downstream and upstream. I can name a few, obviously, Mars, Coca-Cola, Puma. The thing is, a lot of these companies started 5 or 10 years ago asking suppliers to ask other suppliers to ask other suppliers and so on. Tell us where you are, tell us what you do. It took years for all this data to accumulate. So now we have companies that are looking towards third-party consultants, such as ourselves, to actually model a lot of this information so they can have real-time data on their deep supply chain. So we're using algorithms in a machine learning environment to detect where these upstream partners may be. This is a pretty common analytical framework. Sorry there for the text mishap, but what it is essentially is looking at a climate hotspots and the ways in which we can detect it. We generally look at the concentration of assets by region, whether or not they're exposed to a particular hazard, and then what's the sensitivity of that hazard. We often talk about climate impact as if it's this ubiquitous thing that's going to affect everybody. A lot of corporate assets have some measure of criticality. What I mean by that is a data center is far more important than an office. So being able to prioritize what's important and act now and invest early in these assets is a really important feature of corporate adaptation. So that's all a bit abstract. So here's a couple examples. Here's a Fortune 100 company that asked us to look deep in their supply chain and find out where exactly is the largest hotspot. And I like this graphic because it really does emulate those 3 core areas. We look at concentration of goods. We look at a very sensitive commodity. And it's in a location that's obviously quite risky. Indonesia has been known to be not only quite perilous for companies that are trying to extract forest products because of a lot of the illegal logging, illegal drainage of peatlands, and even the fire and air quality concerns in the area. But this is a relatively conscientious manufacturer that had no idea that they had a partner in Indonesia. I pulled this graphic from our latest white paper on equity screening methodology. I encourage you to check it out. I like this graphic a lot because it also emulates those 3 core risk areas. This here is showing the Pearl River Delta. For those of you that are interested in economic hotspots in the globe, I encourage you to take a look at the Guangzhou region of China. There are hundreds more like this. About 2/3 of the world's manufacturing occurs in river deltas. The Pearl River here floods every 5 to 7 years. It's also experiencing a rate of sea level rise faster than the global average. And the variability in storm surge in this area is quite worrying. So what you see here on the right are a series of companies, actually just 2 companies. It's a Chinese-owned oil producer as well as a private Chinese oil producer. And these are all pretty close to shore here. And we partnered with Climate Central, who's an expert at sea level rise modeling to look at the expected impacts. And this is here just a look at 2020, so pretty alarming. Now, when companies want to take a look at what climate risks are going to affect them directly, food and bev and big manufacturing will typically look at a couple key hazards, things like water stress, right? Or things like flooding. We like to broaden that out, and I imagine going forward, we're going to have to be looking at a lot more risk drivers. Everything from water stress, heat stress, flooding, and sea level rise to cyclones to wildfires. I mean, I'm from California. I never thought I'd see a wildfire like I saw this last summer. And the impacts on not only operations and supply chains, but the impacts on employees, the impacts on local health, and the impacts on local ecosystems. So corporate and community resilience really do go hand in hand, and this is an argument that I think we need to push when we're talking to large corporations, and making sure that we understand the value of natural capital and human capital in generating value. So we often talk about shareholder price, or we talk about the stability of equity prices and shareholder satisfaction as the end-all be-all when we talk to corporations, because that's what gets you in the door. But at the end of the day, a lot of us are coming from other perspectives. I'm a hydrologist by training, and so I like to think that healthy river and healthy critters is the best indication of a good ecosystem. And I think corporations are beginning to understand this, that there are these pathways in which they can work at to really boost their own value. And again, internally, the buy-in is all about brand management. It's about reducing disruptions. It's about making sure that they're beating their competitors, and that's where I see the biggest opportunity here in corporate involvement is If you don't act now, someone else is going to act, and if they're in your space, they're going to beat you. This is another graphic I like to show because these are some Fortune 100 companies that you may recognize in the San Francisco Bay Area. Everything from big tech to big banking to aerospace. And I think this is a 2050 outlook with a median scenario for sea level rise with I can't see the map, I think it's a 50-year storm surge. But what you can see here is there's quite a bit of capital tied to land and tied to place. And some of our largest corporations aren't just going to pick up and move. And that's really what you hope when we're working in corporate adaptation, is that it doesn't result in maladaptation. Because sometimes it can be easy just to move, especially in developing countries where labor prices are low, land prices are low. It's very easy just to take an adaptation action that is cheap. And my point here is that we should be focused on retrofitting infrastructure, because it is cheaper to do that than to actually move and to invest in local human capital. Now, I just want to finish by saying there are a few best practices at the operational level and supply chain level that we should be aware of, but at the end of the day, a lot of this is about behavior change. And if we're in the boardroom where we're talking about the type of ROI or value that you can reap from investing in corporate adaptation projects, the metrics that we're using to understand value in some regard, and start incorporating some of this climate risk information in order to make a better determination of future value. So with that, thank you.